enormously. You and your son make a really good 1-2 punch. I mean,
Thank you.
It was really good. I only, you know, the thing I regretted, I didn't have my camera to capture it so that we could put it on YouTube and let people have it. We'll get a chance to get some of that here now, and I'm
Good.
welcome to MNN. Great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to you in the audience. Welcome very much in the audience. It's a pleasure, a great personal pleasure. Welcome to the program. Dr. Richard Wolff, or Rick as he likes to be called, I think. He's a Ph.D. and a true, honest-to-God scholar of economics. He's a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst currently after a long and distinguished career, and he has a resume that would, as you say in the vernacular, knock your socks off. He's written mightily in terms of economics, and it's a great pleasure, Richard, to welcome you to conversation.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. As I said to you, we'd like to begin by just having you share a little of your background. I guess you come out of Ohio originally, but could you share a little where you're born and raised, educated, and then we can talk about economics, the current state of the American and world economy, and then some theoretical understandings of what's going on in terms of the human condition.
Okay. My folks left Europe to get away from Adolf Hitler. And they landed and ended up through the kind work of the American Friends Service Committee in Youngstown, Ohio. So when I was born, my father, who had been a lawyer in Europe, got a job as a steel worker in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company in Youngstown. Traveled around a good bit as he was looking for work. He finally got work in the New York area, and we settled, and I grew up in a town called New Rochelle, a suburb of New York.
45 minutes from Broadway.
Something like that. My education, well, I was the child of immigrants who were very determined that I make it in the new world. And so I worked real hard and under a good bit of pressure. And so I ended up going to all the right schools. In those days, those schools were open to immigrants' kids. So I went to Harvard, and then I went to Stanford.
You took your undergraduate work at Harvard?
At Harvard.
I think you got a magna cum laude degree.
Yes, I did very well. My parents required me to do well, and I was a good boy.
That was all in liberal arts and that sort of thing?
History. I majored in history.
Okay, right, history, right, okay.
And when I finished my education in history, the one thing that became clear to me was that I needed to understand the economy. It was the part of history that the professors at Harvard had a lot of trouble with. They didn't want to go near it. They were afraid of looking at the economic sides of things. So it was a real deficit in my education. And so I decided to remedy that by going to graduate school in economics.
And economics is really important to understanding. They used to call it political economy in Europe, I think.
Right.
It's really important in terms of trying to understand all the realities of the
Absolutely.
world in the most immediate kind of way, isn't it?
Yes, and then it became clear to me that leaving the economic aspect of things out meant you'd have a very strange and incomplete understanding of history and therefore also of the present.
Yeah.
So I went to Stanford, and
how did you happen to go to Stanford? Did you get a degree, a scholarship, or?
I got a scholarship. I was I was the Herbert Hoover Scholar there because I had done well at Harvard, and people tend to think that if you went to Harvard, there's something really special about you. Frankly, I've never understood that, but it is what happens, and so it makes it easier for you later. And I went to Stanford, and there was a professor there named Paul Baran, who was an unusually interesting critic of the American economic system, and I wanted to study with him. And
this was at Harvard or at Stanford?
This was Stanford.
Stanford, all right, yeah.
But unfortunately, in the spring of the year I came there, he had a heart attack and died.
Oh,
and so I wanted to come back east, which is where I felt more comfortable.
You had thought of going there because of him, then?
Yes,
That's what I thought of graduate school. You study with somebody.
Yes, I went to study with him.
Yeah.
And I had a wonderful opportunity. He gave me a lot of time. But when he died, there was really no longer a reason for me to stay.
There wasn't anybody there to carry on, right?
No, and I came back east.
You took a degree there, though, at Stanford.
I got a master's degree in economics at Stanford at the end of the year. But I discovered a new program that had just started at Yale University called the Economic History Program. It combined economics and history.
Well, they used to say political economy, political history, and it's sort of a grounding for understanding history in realistic terms.
And they were open to mixing the history and the economics. That's exactly what I wanted. They also were very generous in scholarship help for me. And since my folks were immigrants, we had no money. So I came back east and I finished my education at Yale.
Yeah.
So, and I got my Ph.D. at Yale and a couple of more master's degrees. So I'm a poster boy for American higher education.
And for American boy makes well in
Yes.
terms of...
For 10 years, I lived in the Ivy Leagues of America and learned my economics and my history and got my degrees. And then went on to teach.
Yeah, and you were at the best schools, Harvard, Yale, Stanford. You were mingling about the better classes of our society. I suppose you built a hell of a Rolodex and everything, and all the social connections that are going to get you big paying jobs on Wall Street and so forth. You could have been equipped for that, right?
Yes, although I think what actually happened to me was that it was very good to go to those schools because having been there for 10 years, at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, I was immune to any possible misunderstanding that anything special goes on there.
Really? Okay,
Yes.
right. You,
No, I
you
learned
weren't
that-
impressed with what you
No,
learned or anything
no.
at the feet
The
of all the
quality-
great people there?
No, the quality of the education was mediocre in most cases. There were a few professors that were good, just as there are a few professors who are good at all schools. But most of the professors there had as their main goal in life being famous, getting lots of attention, running off to Washington, writing books. What they did in their classroom was usually the last on the list of important things in their lives, and as a result, they didn't do a particularly good job. They left it to graduate student assistants. No.
And adjuncts?
Yeah, that was more recent. We didn't have so many adjuncts back then.
They had graduate assistants.
Graduate students who were themselves getting Ph.D.s,
Right.
who were called assistants,
Yeah.
but in many cases did the lion's share of the work.
They were like indentured slaves.
Yes, and
Yeah.
and sometimes,
They
however,
were-
as students, we weren't so upset about it because having had a few lectures from the professor, we preferred the graduate students. They did a better job.
It's interesting. A professor, in terms of being able to be impart knowledge and so forth, does not necessarily comport with what he's written down in the books and so forth.
Absolutely.
The reputation that precedes him.
I like to tell a story that I've been a professor.
I'll bet you're a really good professor.
Well,
on the basis of what I saw at the Brecht Forum, you were really engaging. I mean,
I like it.
Yeah, right.
that
It
helps.
was obvious that you did.
It helps if you really like it.
Yeah,
but
it does.
on the
In life in general. I
Yes,
think, yeah.
absolutely.
If you like life, you're better off than...
What many Americans don't understand, including people who've been to college, is that in 99% of the cases, to be a professor in the United States does not require you at any time to take even an hour's seminar in how to teach. It's sort of assumed, even though it makes no sense at all, that if you have stayed in school long enough to get a Ph.D., you are then somehow qualified to teach. That's what we call in the old Latin a non sequitur. That doesn't work. It makes no sense. Teaching is a skill. That's why we have many schools of education in the United States, because it's a complicated skill or art or craft. And if you have most college teachers without any expertise in it, you're going to get the result we have, which is lots of very poor teaching.
Yeah, you have the old saw about those who can't do and those who can't teach.
Yes.
Which is an old saw about how the teacher was really the school marms. It was teaching in the high school level or in the elementary was a thing that was done. You know, it wasn't thought of as something that was, and yet it may be of the highest calling, actually. Right. Being able to bring out from people. Educate means, I don't know, you do Latin, I can't remember all those irregular verbs. It means drawing out or something like that. And also the kids.
In some countries, I don't mean to interrupt, but in some countries, a distinction is made between researcher and teacher. So a university will hire this person to be a researcher, and it's understood they're being hired to conduct research and to write and to add to the store of written knowledge.
Important task.
Important task. And that you hire different people who have a different function. That is, they're mainly supposed to do that very complicated thing of collecting what's been accumulated in knowledge and finding a way effectively not only to teach it, but to excite students about it. And you don't ask the teacher to do the research, and the research, it's a recognition that there are different ways of being a scholar.
No.
In the United States, we don't do that. We basically clump them together. We demand of most professors that they do both things. And what they've really been trained for is research. And what they are forced to do and often don't want to do and therefore aren't good at, teaching.
Yeah, teaching, wasting all the time with these students. When
Yeah, and the students are required to sit there
and
hour after hour together in a room with a person who doesn't want to be there.
And you can't even go to sleep if you want to,
No.
unless you get a big book. A big fat tome, Mr. Gibbon, you could put in front of you to go to sleep or something.
Well, nowadays, increasing number of students have those very tiny devices in their ears.
iPods.
And they have a nice smile listening not to you.
No, they're not listening to you. That's right, and everything. And then, you know, the thing is that I think in a certain sense, my favorite human beings are 5-year-olds. 5-year-olds are so gorgeous. They're so honest and everything, and they're curious about everything. They're really curious. And I saw a thing, let me just lay it out. We want to get talking about the economy and so on, but I saw a study once, and I got a subjective gauge in my mind. It's about 90% accurate in terms of the overall thing. A group of psychologists took a measure of what they would call the creative state of consciousness or a being, and then they linked that to age. And in every country across the world, every cross-culture, it peaks around 5. And then it goes down.
Right.
We're going to school then, but we're also learning a lot of things that people are trying to teach us. And they're like training people. Also, there's a discipline to that when you've got a thing where you're trying to please the person in terms of a grading system, or you're going to get advanced and all that. Competition, a lot of testing going on now to measure all that kind of thing and everything. I think that might really well get in the way of the creativity or the interest on the part of the individual in something who's running down something because they're really interested in themselves, like a hound dog after a fox. What do you think? Do you think autodidact is a term that's coming more and more onto the lips of many people?
It's an old idea that periodically resurfaces when, at least here in the United States, when some honesty allows enough people to recognize that the educational system has major problems that cannot be solved by throwing more money at the problem or not be solved by this or that little rule, there begins to be a grudging awareness that in order to educate, you have to involve the learner in a process of self-discovery, of discovering the world, and that the teacher's job is to facilitate, not to dominate and to control.
Right.
And that's very complicated. It threatens the domination of administrators over faculty and faculty over students.
Right.
We live in a very hierarchical society.
We do indeed. And
it's not surprising that our educational system falls into that pattern.
Right.
But it doesn't work well for education.
No, not for, but it is one of the charges overall in a systems kind of way of is teaching people to do what they're told by an authority figure, which is a very important thing, so you'll fit into corporate cubicle bureaucracies and that kind of thing. And all of our institutions are hierarchical and so forth. It seems to me they're not really very creatively organized.
For me, the central issue, if I had to pick something,
yes, please,
is in education, the rule is that the teacher knows and the student is to copy the teacher.
Right.
The teacher tells the student, this is right, this is wrong. The irony is the teacher themselves are constantly, each of them, caught up in relationships with colleagues who disagree with them about many different issues. They're constantly required to recognize that there are different ways of understanding how the world works, different ways of approaching problems, different ways of finding answers. But instead of teaching an appreciation for difference,
learning for learning,
what they do is they teach right and wrong. The child is culturated to believe that you get rid of wrong ideas and get the right one.
Rather and the right ones happen to be mine.
Yes, happen to be whoever's in authority.
Yes, right. An authority
it's very
figure.
dangerous.
Yeah, it is very dangerous.
And periodically, there's a recognition that this is dangerous. And not only dangerous for the process of learning, but dangerous for any notion of democracy.
Also, not only democracy, but also the fact, like the Vedics have this thing, they say there are no academic disciplines in reality. It is. We were talking about political economy, history, but really reality is a seamless web. Everything is interconnected to everything else. And the idea of specializing, and people get a specialized take on one thing, then they become the greatest expert in the world in the use of the pluperfect tense in 13th century poetry in the south of France or something. And then they will treat that endlessly. And they're very fascinated with that. And they get rewarded for being specialized and so forth. But to see patterns in a creative kind of way between disciplines and at the interface where the disciplines interconnect is where the action is in a certain sense. We don't have a thing, we don't have a department of everything in the university or something, and yet, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I see this very clearly in my field in economics.
Yes.
Where, Lord knows, and I teach courses in the history of economics as a discipline.
Okay.
No discipline is as diverse and complicated as economics. The whole history for 300 years of thinking about the economy, the whole history of that discipline is a history of radically different ways of understanding what an economy is, how it works, why it has the problems it does, what might be the solutions. It's a universe of profound disagreement. Yet the irony, the way it is taught in most schools in the United States, is as if understanding the economy is no more complicated than understanding how your car works. The carburetor does this, the motor does this. Students are told this is the way the economy works. They are not told we don't agree on how the economy works. We don't agree on how to understand it. We look at different things, that the world is a place of profound disputation about what economics is. Nope. The students are given this rote kind of simple-minded, narrow definition, and all it does is it deprives young people of the breadth of approaches that they could otherwise bring to solving the real problems of our economy.
Thank you.
They don't have that.
Yeah,
they just have one little narrow technical approach, and if that doesn't work, they sit there befuddled.
And a lot of people are trying to turn that into an exact science, economics.
Yes.
It can be done in linear
pretend.
regression, things
That's
like
right.
that, and kind of thing.
All little technical.
And yet, in terms of the practical realities, I told you on the telephone yesterday that I had a program I did with Isaac Asimov one time, that great person who had written on everything under the sun, and the only discipline that he could not fathom, he could not understand, was economics. The one thing he couldn't write on, and yet economics is more important probably than politics. It's probably more important in terms of everyday life than anything else, but there's a tremendous confusion and the eyes glaze over when they consider the dismal science.
Yeah, and I think it has something to do with what I just said. That is, I don't know Isaac Asimov, but I would guess that a way to translate what he said would be the following. When he went to school, he learned economics is this thing. Here's how it works. Here's how to understand it. Here's what the problems are. Here's the solution. Very straightforward, very mechanical. But his gut and his brain had already told him that the world is much more complicated than these simple-minded models that economists work with. And so there was a disconnect between the economy, in which, after all, every student lives. Every student has had countless conversations over dinner with mom and pop and Uncle Louie, in which the economy was discussed, and he could see or she could see disputations between what mom thought and what papa thought, because it looks different to the two people. And so there's an awareness of complexity, an awareness of difference of opinion, and yet when you walk into the classroom, all that is brushed aside. You're given this simple-minded little story, and there's a reaction. And one of the ways to handle that is to say, well, this economics is not for me.
Well, that was him. That's what he said. He couldn't do it. And they do that. But also it informs, if that's the term we use, it informs mightily the political process itself that we put so much concentration upon. You know, because there is a theoretical understanding of what it is that is behind the political process, which is economic. And the economic questions are probably, in an everyday world, more significant than you have the right to vote every 4 years or something. In terms of the economic situation, and we don't understand it. You understand it well, having taught the history of economics, and you have certain thoughts on it and so forth, and we want to talk about that kind of thing, both theoretically, because I guess it began about, modern economics began around with Adam Smith, along at the same time the steam engine came along. And then we have the Ricardo and so forth, and classical and Marshall and all that. We have this kind of history of economic thinking, and it's down now to where, do you think we have a proper understanding, our leadership, our political, economic, or even intellectual leadership, has a proper understanding of an economic model that the future would perhaps require an altered vision from other than that which we've inherited out of history? Or are we at a time for a new understanding, not only politics, but maybe of the whole evolution of events on this universe, that we have a vision that is adequate to what the future requires? Or do we see big changes coming that are required?
Well,
in understanding and in policy.
I don't mean to repeat myself, but basically, I think the people in charge of the United States economy, at least in the government part, which is only a small part of it, have exactly what I said. They're the products of the American higher education training in economics.
At Harvard, Stanford, and Yale.
Perfect examples.
Right?
That's where they mostly come from.
Yeah.
It's very narrow, very uniform, very much within a very limited framework. That's how they analyze the problems. That's how they find solutions. And the American people already know how well they've done. I mean, let me give you just a couple of examples.
Okay.
We had an extraordinary stock market boom in the second half of the 1990s.
Yeah.
Right? It took on a dimension unprecedented in history, crazy upticks in value, huge amounts of money made. Everybody understood this is very strange. The dominant view was this is reasonable, there's special reasons for this. Mr. Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, assured us
was at the helm, yeah.
At the helm, and he assured us we are in a new economic system. They called it the new economy. Everybody thought this was reasonable, except for a few people who said, but they were effectively kept quiet until the stock market collapsed in the beginning of the year 2000, and it's still not recovered in terms of the NASDAQ, the important stock market for new technology and so on, hasn't begun to recover from
We're into
the
1,300 on the Dow now.
That's right, but we're not
13,000.
But the NASDAQ has never recovered from this situation. Then Mr. Greenspan went on to depress interest rates to keep us out of a recession that produced a boom in housing, which is now falling apart and frightening everybody. You know, the people who have been in charge have not done a good job, and everyone kind of understands it, but because of the narrowness, no one kind of has either the courage or the training to go a little bit outside and once again ask whether some of those other ways of thinking about the economy and examining it and coming up with different solutions might pay some sense, might pay us to pay attention. It's very hard to get people to do that if their training has been as narrow as the economics training has been. And you can see in our classes in the university that more and more the kind of people who come to economics because they want to understand the world and change it for the better are pushed away because it's made so narrow and so technical that the students who stay are the technical students, the engineering students who see it as a puzzle to be solved, are not interested in the broader social implications, and so the profession becomes narrower and narrower and less interesting until it literally self-destructs, which I believe it is in the process
you
of
think
doing.
that's going, and the economics, the discipline in our nation and so forth is going that way?
It's becoming a narrow technical specialty, increasingly disconnected from what everybody else thinks. You know, the business world figured this out decades ago. We had a very peculiar thing in America. We have economics departments which thought they were teaching economics, but what they were teaching was so narrow and so technical and so much devoted to celebrating capitalism rather than understanding it.
As a science. They wanted to see it as a science like Boyle's Law or
that
something
the business community began to realize that the economics being taught was useless for their own needs. So we have in America two systems of training in economics. One is called economics, and the other one is called the business school. It's very strange. They teach many of the same things. It's just the business community is disgusted with what economics is and developed their own universe of teaching.
Models,
You know, if the labor movement in America had the same understanding and the same resources, they would long ago have decided the same thing and created labor schools, because the economics taught in the university is as useless for trade union people as it has been shown to be for business.
We've had a number. Maybe we could tick off a few if we could, because I remember Mr. Nixon in 1972, he said, we're all Keynesians now. I remember he made that statement and so forth. So we've had in the modern experience, what do we have? We had Ricardo, we had Smith, Ricardo, Marx, then we had Marshall, and then we had what? We had Keynes. We had Schumpeter, Hayek, Friedman, the monetarists, and so forth. And when Mr. Nixon said, we're all Keynesians now, if you were to look out on the world, what are we all now, if we are anything? Is it all Chicago? Is it all Friedman? Is it all monetarist viewing of things in terms of informing the political class and so forth that's operating this economy?
Very good question. And the answer has to do again with the culture of higher education, particularly in economics. Because it's a narrow field, it is so frightened of dealing with difference, of dealing with debate and alternative, that we can't, in the United States, we can't really accept that an economics department could be, and indeed should be, a place where students are introduced to alternative perspectives on what the whole thing is about and how to think of it.
The whole thing being, if I may, the whole thing being economics, are you
right,
talking about?
The economy. What is the economy? And the crucial question, how does the economy connect to, fit in, the larger society as a whole?
Thank you very much for that. They have a term, the war is too important to leave up to the generals.
Right.
Is the economic questions too important to be left to the economists
Yes.
in their own little cubicle like monitor, and they're not taking into a more comprehensive context? You had a comprehensive context, that kind of thing, and they're not taking into that kind of a context.
That's right.
Well
so
enough.
Here's what happens.
That's a problem of turf, and people arguing over ideas that are almost just based upon theory.
Right. But I understand, for example, that my perspective is different from other people in economics.
Okay.
I don't find that terrifying. I don't find that frightening. It seems to me that a student must be presented with serious advocates of alternative perspectives doing the best job they can to articulate those, and let the student hear, think, and, dare I say it, choose freely among alternative perspectives. Our economics profession is much too frightened to do that. So we have a succession of fads.
Yeah.
In the period after World War II and the Great Depression, Keynesianism was not only the dominant, but it pushed everything else out. And then, not surprisingly, when finally the conservatives fought back and overthrew the Keynesian dominance, they followed with Milton Friedman and established the Chicago dominance and pushed out all the Keynesians.
And that came with Reagan then?
Yeah, came in with Reagan.
About 1980.
The whole society went to the right. Economics profession
We're still
dutifully followed.
We're still there?
Yeah, we're still there, but we're running out of gas.
We're running out of gas. That paradigm, that time is running out.
The economic problems in an American working class that today is suffering under a level of physical exhaustion, mental alienation, a level of debt no working class has ever seen before. These are all new phenomena. From 1820 to 1970, the real wages, the standard of living of American workers went up decade over decade.
Yeah, those were the golden years. Those were years we grew up in. We were very privileged.
That's right.
In a way.
And no other capitalism was able to do that.
Yeah.
And Americans got the idea that working in the United States, with a country of immigrants, meant achieving and enjoying a rising standard of living.
And everybody did, more or less. We still had some of Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we had pockets who didn't, but in general
but we
it
addressed
did.
that in the 60s, but somewhat.
And so a peculiar thing happened in America. An ideology settled in that while work became ever more difficult, rising productivity, more use of machines, greater intensity of work, workers could suffer the intensity of labor in the United States because they got a payoff. They got higher wages. Job might be a burden, but you could go to the mall at the end of the day. And
a Walmart.
And consumption is the compensation for labor. In economics, it's enshrined with the idea labor is a disutility, a drag, and the payoff is consumption.
Yeah, right.
Okay? So What happens to a society that has 150 years of that when something happens, middle of the 1970s, and the increase in the real wages of the American worker stops and becomes a decline? Most of the years since the 1970s, American wages, real wages, what you can actually buy with your wages, has been going down. My analysis is that this is like a trauma. This is like a shock. This is like a frightening phenomena that most Americans are still not yet aware of, haven't yet come to learn how to cope with.
A lot of people in denial.
Yes.
Reading
fundamental denial.
Norman Vincent Peale and thinking positive and things
That's right.
and blaming themselves. And
Either
they put that on
they do
the
three things.
advertising agencies.
They
do
blame
that.
themselves because they have come to equate personal success with rising standard of living.
Right. The Puritans told us that, didn't they, with the Puritan ethic?
Absolutely. So what does a working class, the vast majority of Americans, what are they going to do if they measure their own self-worth, if their own sense of themselves, of their meaning and their success in the world is measured by consumption, but the wages they get per hour of work don't allow them to consume more? They did two things. First, they put in more hours. Here's a statistic that most Americans don't know. In the last 25 years, the average number of hours worked in Western Europe, in countries like France, Germany, Italy, and so on, has dropped by about 20%.
Yeah, I think they're in advance of us.
Over the same 25-year period, the amount of hours worked by an American worker has gone up by 20%.
And the wife's in the business, and the teenagers.
Absolutely. More members of the family are sent out. The household falls apart. That's half the reason we have a big discussion in America about family values, because the pressure of lower wages sent everybody out to work and broke down whatever relationships were sustained inside the household.
Used to be one man could, in the 50s, he could work on a job. All the kids go to college, everything's gone. That's gone. And it's a race to the bottom. The globalization is trapping markets around the world.
And the second thing they did, beside working more, is in order to keep spending more and buying more to make themselves feel good about life, if they didn't have higher wages and if extra hours didn't do it, they borrowed money. And over the last 25 years, the debt, you borrow on your house, you buy your car on time, you max out a successive number of credit cards, you send your kid to school on a borrowed budget. It's overwhelming, and no one knows what's going to happen to an economy that is now beginning to run out of the capacity of borrowing more because they're borrowed up to here. The wages are still tending down. There's no more hours you can put in. We are already the working population most dependent on drugs of any in the world, as well as most dependent on debt. You're at a point in which one could say, and I would say, that this is an economy in severe stress and strain, trying to cope with something it barely understands. Meanwhile, the public discourse coming out of the economics profession.
Everything's great. 13,000.
Everything's fine. Nothing to worry about.
14,000. And the people at the top, the 20% or so, are doing very well by and large.
The very, very top people are doing very well. The massive people are, as I described them.
Labor's in disarray.
That's right.
They're under 8% now in the private sector, I think, have any labor organization, any of that kind of solidarity that was there in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and so forth, that kind of thing. And it's heading for that. Then you got globalization going on. They're shipping jobs to China like crazy. They're taking advantage of slave wager and ecological ignoring of things and so forth in those countries and so forth, heading for that. But beyond that, there's also Lord Keynes when he said, beyond the outsourcing and the going and taking advantage of that's going on in the name of globalization, comparative advantage, all that kind of thing, you also have, and Lord Keynes in his thing to his grandchildren, he wrote a letter to his grandchildren in 1930, that's about now, he said, you are going to be confronted with something you can't see now, but we are going to be confronted with massive technological displacement of labor. Now, I don't know if that's the case because all of our basic grounding policy statement for the United States is still the Employment Act of 1946. It's like the basic policy. We are going to distribute income to everybody and all of your politicians. It will only be distributing of income through their labor participation in having a job. That's the way they're going to have distributed income. And yet we have technological instruments and other aspects to the productive process other than labor are now increasingly more responsible for the actual production. And those, let's call them assets. I'm not sure if we could relate them in another kind of way, because the government, bonds and so forth, they're part of the overall structure. But they're all owned by a tiny, plutocratic, minuscule plutocratic class. And it seems to be we accept that somehow, that it's all right for a small group of people to own virtually all the capital, all the other than labor aspects of production. And I wonder, is that based on the labor theory of value? And would you've studied this, the labor theory of value is that all production is done by human labor, and everything, it's okay for a small group of plutocrats to own the capital assets that represent everything other than labor, and that is what's becoming responsible, and the trends are, on a world scale, that's what's becoming responsible increasingly for production other than labor. Why do we accept the idea that it's okay for a small group of people to own it rather than a democratic ownership of technological instruments? Let's say technology is another word for capital assets or something. Why don't we have an uprising or something to where we democratize the ownership of the machines that are increasingly responsible for production, which could bring perhaps greater capital formation, economic distribution, and leisure, as many of the people saw, rather than keeping everybody in a treadmill, and that we're going to distribute all income to the masses of the people, and they're like the feudal estate, they own all the assets, and we're picking up leaves, and they set the template for the whole society, and we're just picking up leaves on their estate. Why do we accept that? Well, or could you help shape that? Maybe it begins with this labor theory of value that's been associated with Marx in large measure, and you've done a lot of study of Marx, but it's also basically fundamental to all of the economic theory, it seems to me, virtually, that's been used to try and rationalize political organization of society throughout history and is today.
Well, the labor theory of value is one of those ideas like God or like happiness that have meant very different things to very different people.
Thank you.
And so it's been put to use in a variety of ways. Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who looked upon as the founders of economics as a modern discipline, both found the labor theory of value that they understood to be useful to understanding what's going on in the economy. And the idea there is really quite simple, that human beings have from day one used tools and equipment to make things better in their lives, to produce goods and services that they need, but that in the end, the really scarce thing in our community is people. People are the point of what we produce to make people's lives better, and people are the ultimate resource. A machine does not work by itself. A tool does not work by itself. Not yet.
At a certain point it will.
Maybe, but we haven't got there yet.
And would it be bad if it did?
No.
Would it be good to put people out of the economic productive process? Because that's the way in which they all get their sense of identity by their thing. That's the major way in which people get a sense of identity. And it may be that there are other patterns by which we should, instead, and the work ethic, and bowing down to the work ethic and that kind of thing. And meanwhile, these guys get richer as they sleep by owning the machine that some guy's pushing the button toward. And there's a trend in that direction.
Right. I think, I agree with that, but I think, let me finish my story a little bit.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Marx is the first one who used the idea of the labor theory of value to really make the point you're trying to get after, to say, look, if what makes things valuable in the end is labor, and if what can help labor produce things...
Well, I take exception with that premise.
Right, but...
Yeah, okay.
I think you may not disagree with the way I do it.
Perhaps, okay.
If machines are also able to participate in the production...
Productiveness rather than productivity, which is tied to labor.
Fine. So let's assume the people do their part and the machines do another.
Well, machines is an abbreviation for everything else other than human labor.
Fine. Technology, let's call it.
I'll say land.
Or land.
Structures and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me go through the argument.
Okay.
If you take the worker away, things can't be produced. We need people to produce it. And the same applies to the land, and the same applies, say, to the machines. But what the same does not apply if you take away the owner of the machines or the owner of the land. To be brutally honest,
Yeah, okay.
the owner of the land can be pushed aside. The land is still there.
Right.
The machine's owner can be pushed aside. The machine
is
still there.
And it was the laborers who built the machine.
And it was the laborers who built the machine.
That's part of it, yeah.
And the landowner sure as hell didn't make the land.
Okay.
So we have the possibility to say, look, if workers make the machines, and the machines then help future workers to be more productive than they otherwise would, it is perfectly reasonable to say that the produce of human effort can be distributed to all the people in whatever way we want. There's no obligation.
But do we there is some bureaucratic agency that's going to determine
no,
need?
let it be decided democratically by the majority like we decide other issues.
Not the market.
Not the market.
Not the market.
Not the market.
Would we eliminate the market? Would you want to eliminate
My guess is,
the private sector?
My guess is that we already eliminate markets in lots of places.
Okay.
Let me give an example
Please.
that sometimes people enjoy. I tell the story of a Thanksgiving dinner. And your family gathers around, you make your turkey, and your young daughter, who has been taking an economics course at the university but is home for Thanksgiving,
Yes.
having learned about how efficient markets are and how appropriate they are and how wonderfully they work, at the end of the Thanksgiving dinner, Grandma leans across the table and asks Louise to please take out the garbage that has collected, the daughter from college.
Yeah.
And Louise smiles at Grandma and says, "Sure, Grandma, that'll be $3.
Right.
At that point, her father, in an outburst of outrage, jumps up and says, "That's disgusting.
Yes.
This is a family. We all love each other. We don't ask money from one another.
Well, there's
we don't
something
do
to-
things by exchanging quid pro quo. I'll do the garbage if you give me $3. And
Apply
he
that
explains,
to sex.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
He applies it, and he tries to teach her. Here we enjoy helping each other,
Right.
sharing,
Right.
doing for one another. You can't have a loving relationship, he says, if the way you treat each other is, I'll give you $3 for this if you give me $2.
Everything's a transaction.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what the
People
father,
are thinking that way.
Yeah, but what the father is explaining to the daughter, if I can translate his language, is the market may be okay outside the household, but it is the enemy of love inside the household.
Absolutely. Not only the household, but the society.
Right. But if
the society.
Right. But here's the point.
But you're out there 8 hours a day in a society that's teaching you necessarily you're doing all that. You're going to bring some of that home to the family, don't you think?
Right. And if the father's
and
words
going to alienate.
But if the father's words are to be taken seriously, it might lead us to ask the question, if the market is the enemy of love inside the family, might it also be playing the same role outside the
the society?
Right.
If the market is.
But the bottom line here is that markets, contrary to what is taught in economics, markets have not been universally recognized by people as the efficient way to do anything. Not only inside the family, where markets, as in my story of Thanksgiving, are proscribed
you
as
didn't
horrible.
like my applying that to sex, right?
No,
if you have sex and you say you have sex and then you say here's $200, it's a whole different thing than
That's right.
And
Perfect example.
Or an artwork. It's going to get down. It's going to get down to my way of thinking. It's going to get down to where somebody who produces a work of art would no more think of selling it or monetizing it than they would think of asking the money for sex.
Right. Or ask it.
Or selling their.
There are hundreds of examples. If I ask you to go for a walk with me, I'm feeling kind of low.
It's going to cost you $3, Brian, for my company.
Can you imagine? We would both have a moral repugnant feeling about such a thing. But you know, that's not fundamentally different from asking the question, look, I need to build a hospital here because people are sick. So I'm going to need some steel and I'm going to need some bricks to build a hospital where we... And before I can finish my sentence, I got to pay money to the steel maker. I got to make... The question is not, do we have to take care of one another? Of course we do. The steel maker has to earn an income and the coal maker... It's not a question of recognizing that we need each other. It's a question of asking, is the market the way to do that? Well, in our country, the market is holy. It's right up there with deity.
Oh, absolutely.
We're not allowed to...
Bigger than God, I
That
think.
takes us back to economics.
Yeah, right.
In the economics curriculum, market is holy. We study markets, we
They
celebrate
got
markets.
Market fundamentalism has
That's
been
what
in
it
the
is.
saddle for quite a few years now, if
Yes.
not a decade or so.
We have a president
that everything can be solved by that.
we have a
kind of
president,
It's
we
like a
have
fundamentalist thing, like Islamic fascism
Yes,
or something
absolutely.
like that. Do you think? I do.
I refer to economics training in the United States as economics fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And it has become as dominant as religious fundamentalism and playing much the same social role.
Okay, now what about if you take it and you say the market? Now you say the market, that's the market and everything, but what you're talking about is production of things. I mean, we walked around in the Serengeti Plain, and you know, there's been some progress, and I mean, we got things going, and we now have an internet. We now have, my dad was born in 1899, and he died and was buried on his 48th birthday, was the average age of somebody born in 1899. It's now up in the 70s. That's something called progress. There are some progressions. Polio.
Absolutely.
There has been some progress made and everything. It has to do with human effort, and also it has to do with technology. The cybernation thing, it's all coming. I understand Sara Lee, you know, they make that cheesecake.
Yes.
Do you get the cheesecake? It's really good for that. You get the cheesecake, it's all made, it's a great big thing. They got vats of everything. They got, and there's nobody in there. It's all made by machines and so forth. The machines have been made by people turning out cheesecake and so forth. And those machines that are producing the wealth, and the trend is for the machines, just to use as a metaphor. Because it's more complicated, because you get finance and that kind of thing. But that process is more and more able to produce a greater amount of capability and of things that are needed from the material world and so forth, so that there's progress being made, even to the point where maybe we're transcending scarcity, which has been the lot in which all human institutions, we may be coming to a time when we're going to have affluent, if comfortable or affluent leisure, and I see Marxists talking often about transcending scarcity, there's some other people and so forth, we're coming to a point where maybe at the end of this process, we're coming to a new situation in terms of the ontology or the reality, where there's nothing wrong with having a television set or a computer or a good functioning automobile or all of the progress of the modern world, and everybody should have a right to have that, particularly with good design and non-polluting solutions and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that.
Not at all. It's just, but it needs to have a balance. The use of the concept progress has mostly been...
You call yourself a progressive. People do.
I don't. But
you don't? Oh, you do not? Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
For me, the concept of progress is a disguise.
Okay.
It is used overwhelmingly, not always, but overwhelmingly by people who really are making a different claim. They want to use the word progress in order to cover a complicated and contradictory situation with the veneer as though it weren't complicated and contradictory, but it was all basically good. That's what progress is for.
Well,
let me give you an example from your example.
Progressive, you know.
You use the example of a life expectancy in the 70s rather than in the 40s. Well, let's be careful. The life expectancy in, say, Russia and parts of Eastern Europe
now,
and Africa has been going down in the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's on a
the
system.
The gap between the life situation of the entire continent of Africa and much of the rest of the world has gotten worse.
Oh, yeah.
There's no progress. There are diseases decimating huge populations that shouldn't be hurting anybody. We may have been able to produce more, but our skill at sharing it to make a decent life for ourselves on this planet.
On a system scale for everybody.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say
it's
progress. I would seem to me we have had serious regression in the collectivity, the sharing that we're supposed to have and that our major religions claim they are all committed to.
They all do.
We're failures. We haven't made progress.
We do very
We have
bad.
regressed.
We do very bad, as the Gospels would say we should, to treat the least among us.
Yeah, nothing of the sort.
Completely the opposite.
So
it's
I don't
all
like the
geared
word.
to,
I don't like the word progress because it tends to want to downplay, erase, marginalize the areas that are screaming out for us. You know, if Africa was in difficulty 40 years ago, and we have made a tremendous increase in wealth since then, and Africa is worse off, that screams as a cataclysmic failure of the world to cope with its problems.
Not only Africa.
Here in the United States, the distribution of income, the gap between rich and poor, has gotten markedly worse.
It's worse than 1889 France.
Yeah.
I mean, 1789 France. The
So why do we
gap.
call this progress?
Well, I don't know. Maybe you'd get a different view. Take a look at a long view. We've been here 200,000 years. The Homo sapien first appeared. I think there's been some progress in terms of the evolution of understanding, consciousness, something. There was Australopithecine. They had a certain kind of progress. Up the hominoid line, we get Homo habilis, we get Homo erectus, and then we get Homo sapien sapien. And Homo sapien sapien can make the environment different by extending their consciousness out in the environment, make a different kind of world and build a world, Golden Child talked about and so forth. So that we're getting to a point, and we do have hygiene. I mean, it used to be pretty grim when the slaves were all wallowing around in the mud on feudal estates and so forth out of history. James Joyce said history is a nightmare. You don't think it's getting better? Or let's say capability. The capability that we have is getting better to the point where perhaps we're coming to a point where we are able to overcome the scourges of the ancient scourges for everybody. We don't have a system of distribution because it's all a bunch of mafia dons fighting with protection rackets to coerce the people, and they don't have a vision because all of our institutions were formulated within a context in history that was valid in history, but we've transcended it. Perhaps that's a positive view of the use of technology for the good use of the benefiting all of humanity plus the ecology, and that we have a capability, just as we have weapon systems now that can destroy the whole species. That we're coming to a time of qualitative transformation in the evolution of our system on this planet.
I understand that, what you're saying, to be a hope. I do not understand it as a description. Let me again try to say it with an example. One of the achievements we have in the Western world has to do with food production.
Yeah.
But if you study closely, for example, the enormous role played in the enhancement of the diets here in the United States of corn production.
Yeah.
Corn as a central commodity, corn as the feed for the animals and so on. And if you read, Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma or a dozen other modern works, you will discover that the achievement of more food has had to go together with the destruction of large portions of our health by virtue of the chemicals used to produce that food. You will discover that the ecological damage in the course of becoming monocultural dependence on corn is very serious and whose long-term consequences we're only beginning to discover. This is not an argument.
Carlson made
That's
us
right.
aware of that.
It's not an argument that we haven't got more and better food, but it is an argument that to call it a kind of progress is often playing the role of occluding from us, of not facing the way this system matches its progress with horrific and unnecessary social costs, and inequalities is one of them, that have to be confronted. And so I'm upset usually when I hear about progress because it's part of a song that is attempting to prevent us from seeing or coping with the sides of our society that say to us today, as they have for 150 years, yes, you've made good achievements, but compared to what this country could be and what this society could have in the way of a life for its people, you're falling as short, if not shorter, than in the past.
I'll be done. You think that, right?
Yes, I
okay.
do.
Are you optimistic? We only got a couple minutes left on Saturday. Are you optimistic, pessimistic for the human prospect in an age where we have weapon systems that we can be told with modeled good, efficient understanding that if they're unleashed, and we have all these danger signs and the fighting over things, would mean the end of our species, the end of this hominoid line of evolution of consciousness. We got a telescope that's going to take the measure of the whole universe within 1 millisecond of in 2011, we can take the measure of things in an intellectual sense, the measure of the whole universe and so forth, but we're at a point where, as Carl Sagan would pointed out, that we may not be able to make the transition to a liberated planet for everybody and the ecology, and even though you have the capability to do it, you won't allow systems to come in that will allow us to do what we're capable of doing because we're, are you optimistic for the human prospect, or do you think maybe we're going to blow it all up?
Well, I'm going to answer by quoting to you a person who whose work I admire and has influenced me a lot. And his answer when he was asked this question was, my intellect is pessimistic, but my will is optimistic.
Who is the person?
He's an Italian theorist named Antonio Gramsci. And what he was trying to say was, if I look at the way the world is working, the social forces, it's depressing. The ability of people, the 1/10 of 1% who own the wealth, to use it to enhance their wealth position,
that's what they're
even
doing.
though it keeps the mass of people from the kind of lives they need and want and would make it better for everybody.
Hasn't it always been like that? Has it not always been like that?
Yes. But
okay, thank you.
But it has
That's history then.
It's history, but it has always provoked people to fight against it. And I find as much to be hopeful for in the constant recurring demand of people not to let this go on as I am pessimistic about how long they've been able to do it.
All right, that's good. And
it's a tension.
And if those who are demanding that this thing not go on any longer, what prescriptions would there be in your estimation of how, Bucky Fuller used to have a term, we need an operating manual for Spaceship Earth. You get a microwave, you get an operating manual, how the damn thing works. Something, and at base is a lack of understanding of economics that would take into account that perhaps the labor input to production is less and less, and we ought to, I would think, to democratize ownership of the means of production
I would put it
as a way of forming capital and as a way of distributing income, rather than depending upon putting it all through a labor criteria, which is not serving us very well and is the major problem confronting us perhaps is the labor theory of value informing the political and social process of understanding things as a thesis.
I would put it slightly differently.
Okay, I would think so.
I'd put it this way. We have to, as a people, become willing and able to ask a question that has so far been kept taboo and off the table.
We've only got a minute and a half, so get it in. Use haiku.
Okay.
Okay.
What we have done is tried to think of changing a tax policy, trying to change a government, trying to change. Our problem is in the organization of how we produce the goods and services upon which we depend.
And distribute.
That's right. How we produce them, distribute them, that whole operation. To this moment, we have a mass of people who do the work and a tiny group of people who make the key decisions. In a modern corporation...
Owning the machines that do most of the production.
But in a modern corporation, it's the mass of workers and the board of directors. Average size of board of directors in this country is 16 people. The average size of their employees can range in the hundreds of thousands. So as long as we leave that in place, as long as the people who run American enterprises are boards of directors responsible for the shareholders who put them there.
We better run the credits. Excuse me. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
As long as we do that, we're not dealing with an underlying foundation of the problems we have, and our solutions will fall short. It's a terrible mistake. If you're going to deal with a serious social problem, you got to put everything on the table. You can't have a taboo that can't even be discussed.
Well, one of the taboos that might be able to be brought up is this idea, since it informs all economic theory, virtually all economic theory is this labor theory of value. We're going to distribute to the people through their labor, while the assets that are built up are owned by a small group. It's okay, it doesn't matter who owns it. That question is going to have to be addressed, and you're going to have to bring the people in on being related to the way things are being produced, rather than a work ethic that is coming out of date with what is required, is another idea that could be put on the table, possibly.
I agree with that.
You do agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah? And you're going to distribute, then you would be distributing to them according to their production, their contribution to production,